We're very glad that Jeffrey Schloss has agreed to stay on from another conference that's been going on in Cambridge this past week and has stayed on a number of days to be with us this afternoon. And Jeff is the professor and chair of biology at Westmont College, which is in Santa Barbara in California. And he obtained his PhD originally in ecology and evolutionary biology from Washington University. And then he took undergraduate training in biology and philosophy from Wheaton College. And his book, Evolution and Ethics, is edited with Philip Clayton. It's a great book, and I recommend it. And I think it's been ordered. It's definitely on the list to be on our bookstall. There are a few books which haven't yet arrived. So if it's not there right now, we hope it will be very soon. I want to recommend that book in particular. And Professor Schloss has taken a particular interest over the past few years in this whole arena of altruism we began to touch on this morning, but evolution, altruism, and sociobiology in that whole area. And so his talk this afternoon are the first of two, The End of Love, Evolutionary Theory, Altruism, and Human Flourishing. So thank you very much, Jeff.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. C.S. Lewis, in one of his essays, comments that at the beginning of the natural sciences, it was a little bit like a lion cub behind bars, entertaining to those who held it captive. But more recently, it's grown up and gotten out of the cage and maybe even tasted human blood. That when the sciences turned their attention to humankind and human nature, they became profoundly significant existentially and religiously. And this afternoon, I want to talk about two specific issues that are probably at the, are at the heart of all religious traditions, and that's the nature of religious commitment itself, and also the nature of human love and its role in human flourishing. Now, the fascinating thing is that both of these topics have become exciting arenas of not only evolutionary exploration, but debate in the last few years, and both of them represent long-standing and unsolved challenges to evolutionary theory. Just several years before Darwin, actually, Kierkegaard in Works of Love raised the rhetorical question, from whence comes love? Where does it have its origin and its source? Where is the place, its stronghold from which it proceeds? And within the last few years, evolutionary theory has asked the very same question. Now, I want to do several things in my time with you this afternoon. First of all, did I miss a slide here? I want to acknowledge that evolutionary theory itself has a range of potential religious implications. Some of them are tradition-specific. There are historiographic questions like who was the first human person, the historicity of Adam, Garden of Eden, Noahic flood. I'm just citing issues from the Abrahamic traditions. There are also doctrinal questions. For example, the issue of human uniqueness, the issue of the phyletic unity of humankind, the large issue of what, in terms of doctrine of creation, what was the original creation like? Was it perfect and then somehow has become broken in the Abrahamic traditions, the notion of the fall? Well, these are not narrowly historiographic, but they're profound doctrinal questions that are influenced by evolutionary theory. And then getting yet more general, we have questions of divine action. What role has deity played in the origin of all things, or at particular events, the origin of life, the origin of consciousness? Separate from that is the question, and it really is a separate question from divine action, is the question of divine design and evidence for it. Now, separate from those questions, which are in many respects tradition-specific, there are general religious questions. One of them is the question of cosmic purpose. There are two aspects of this as it relates to evolutionary theory. First of all, and Simon Conway Morris just spent the morning with us on this first aspect, is there a directionality to and possibly a telos to evolutionary history? But related to that, and this is a profound question I think you're going to be dealing with next week, is the question of theodicy and natural evil and the ways in which that interacts with questions that evolutionary biology raises. Next talk, we'll be talking about a little bit about the issue of moral realism and whether or not an evolutionary origin for human moral sense influences our confidence in the existence of transcendent moral reality. And then lastly, there are these two issues which I want to focus on today, the nature of love and the origin of religion. So here we go. I want to do four things with you. First of all, briefly outline a scientific and theological context for this question. Then I want to describe some tremendously exciting breakthrough proposals that launched what has been called the second Darwinian revolution a couple of decades ago, also called the sociobiological revolution. Thirdly, I want to describe some ways in which that revolution has failed, some ways in which it has not engaged the most central questions it wanted to, and describe some interesting and highly contrasting, more recent revisionist accounts, and then conclude with some integrative comments, some theological comments, and if your eyes aren't too glazed over, even make a proposal, scientific proposal for integrating this stuff. Now, before beginning, I do want to say I recognize that this is a diverse group. We have different disciplines, we have different religious traditions and commitments, we have different languages. And my strategy is just going to be to speak with as much jargon as fast as I possibly can. I'll leave all of you in the dust, and that way I won't have any hard questions at the end. No, actually, my strategy is going to be quite self-consciously to modulate the lecture. I'm going to, at some points, be quite general, recognizing that not all of you are biologists or even natural scientists. Other times, describe some more technical issues, and I'm also going to modulate the speed. So my hope is that all of you will catch some of it, and I actually hope that none of you catch all of it. I want to move fast enough that that you leave with questions. Okay, so here we go. First of all, the context of the altruism question. In terms of scientific context, we begin with Darwin's dilemma. He had a chapter in the Origin specifically dedicated to objections to his theory. One of them, by the way, was the fossil record, which was brought up earlier, but another one was this question of altruism. Darwin said that the existence of any character in one individual that existed for the exclusive benefit of another individual, and this is a verbatim quote, would annihilate my theory because natural selection could not produce such a characteristic. And yet, ironically, by the way, it looked, even at his time, that there were numerous such characteristics in the natural world. The existence of sterile casts in insects, for example, spend all their lives having not only a reduction in fitness, but no offspring whatsoever, tending the offspring of others. The existence of warning calls in mixed species flocks of birds. Lots of examples. Darwin didn't have a solution to them. 100 years later, we had hints of a solution, and E.O. Wilson, in his book Sociobiology, described this question as, and again a direct quote, the central theoretical issue in the attempt to explain social behavior by evolutionary biology. And in particular, that theoretical issue is the issue of altruism. Now, what does a biologist mean by altruism? Very simply this. Altruism is any behavior, or for that matter, any characteristic, phenotypic characteristic, that results in the increase of another's fitness at the expense of the fitness of the bearer of that character. In E.O. Wilson's terser phrase, it's simply this. It's genetically self-destructive behavior. If you could imagine a gene encoding for a behavior or a trait that helps somebody else at detriment to the bearer, the fate of that gene would be to die out. That's a huge problem for evolutionary biology because it looks like we have those kinds of traits. Now, I need to make some qualifications. First of all, although I just suggested to you, imagine a gene causing this trait, and there are lots of mathematical models in population genetics that try to explain such things, the altruism question doesn't assume genetic determinism, and it certainly doesn't assume anything as simplistic as one gene coding for one behavior. Really, it's a question of constraints versus determinism. The constraints of biological embodiment. Whatever we are, we emerge out of our biological substrate, and if there is a biology that gives rise to behaviors that help somebody else's biology at expense to our own, and there's another biology that doesn't have that, that biology is going to win. So that's the problem. Now, I do want to distinguish that the altruism question in biology is And by altruism, biologists are focusing on consequences and not intentions. There's been a lot of confusion and sloppiness on this point. But biological altruism is an issue of consequences and not intentions. In other words, it's altruism small a and not altruism big A of the philosophers, giving with the intent or without expectation of return. And then lastly, I want to say that even if it were altruism big A with intentions, that doesn't have anything to do with affections or compassion or empathy. The question of consequences or intentions can be uncoupled from these other attachment or affective dimensions. In other words, altruism is not the same as the Christian virtue of caritas or agape or the Buddhist virtue of compassionate action. In fact, this has an interesting history. The term altruism was introduced by the French atheist sociologist Auguste Comte as an explicit and intentional alternative to the theological virtue of caritas. And in fact, it's largely a negative virtue. In his essay, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis, the very first sentence in the essay, he says, if you ask a typical person today what morality or virtue is, they'll probably say something like it's unselfishness. But Lewis says that that's a negative virtue. That's a virtue of denying or sacrificing yourself, and it doesn't have any reference to the commitment or to the well-being of another or the celebration of the being of another. So these are all limitations of the notion of altruism that I want to, and theologically significant limitations that I want to acknowledge up front, but they're still very relevant for this reason, that evolutionary biology would predict at least that no matter what your feelings, what your professions, what your affections, they ultimately should be constrained by your inability to do something for somebody else at cost to yourself. The biologist Michael Gisel puts it this way: if natural selection is both sufficient and true, it is impossible for a genuinely disinterested or altruistic behavior pattern to evolve. That's a stunning statement. And here we go. I do want to say one thing. In this talk, we're going to concentrate on the evolutionary explanations of altruism. This was my assignment. And, well, hearing the questions that have emerged out of this audience, we might have gone another way, and maybe that's for another time. But there are lots of other forms of human love and apparent love or attachment in the natural world that are of interest. There's parental attachment and affection. There's romance. There's friendship. And those kinds of loves has all sorts of neat slides to keep your interest at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But we're going to stay pretty conceptual here and talk about altruism. Now, current formulations. That was the backdrop of the problem. There are actually 3 scales at which this altruism question emerges. First of all, there's the scale of dyadic cooperation or reciprocity. So Dennis invites me over for dinner. He's coming to Santa Barbara next October. I'll invite him over for dinner back. But the problem in an evolutionary context of reciprocity, and today Simon said that he didn't like the use of the word cheating in animal context. Actually, I don't mind it if you think of it in terms of reciprocal exchange. I mean, cheating just means you don't do your share. And that cheating problem exists even in dyadic cooperation. So here's a cleaner wrasse eating the pathogens off the gums of a large fish. Now the question is, what prevents this wrasse from cheating and taking a little piece of gum, actually nibbling on the gums? And what prevents this fish from cheating and just eating the cleaner wrasse, especially if it's a one-shot encounter? They've never seen each other before, and they're unlikely to see each other again. Same exists in animal grooming studies. I'll give you a back rub if you give me, but what prevents one from kind of shortchanging the other? And of course that exists with human beings too. This can be mathematically formalized by a discipline called game theory. I suspect you've all seen this before, prisoner's dilemma. It's just a payoff matrix for you and your partner. You can cooperate, you can defect, and it turns out that it's best for both if you both cooperate. However, you don't know whether your partner is going to cooperate or not. If your partner does cooperate, Well, it actually turns out better if you take his cooperation, but you defect. And by the way, if your partner defects and you cooperate, that's the worst. That's called the sucker's payoff in game theory. You do better if you defect. So no matter what your partner does, if you're just looking out for your self-interest, you do better if you defect. But the same logic exists for your partner. So it turns out that what's in both of your best rational self-interests is for you both to defect. And in game theory, by the way, this is called the Nash equilibrium, where strategies converge on one winning strategy no matter what your partner does. So it's virtually impossible to break out of Nash equilibrium. So you see why that's a big evolutionary question. How do we ever get out of that? Now that same problem exists even more problematically at the level of group cooperation or collective action. Everybody's cooperating. What prevents me from just not doing my share? Since so many people are doing it anyways, it won't really affect the net yield much, and I might not even get caught. Of course, once I start doing it, other people start doing it, and then you're a sucker. Here's a great application, cheating in undergraduate classrooms. So if everybody's cheating and you're not, you're a sucker. The classic statement of this collective action problem was Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, now 40 years ago, published in Science. Turns out, by the way, that this essay is one of the most widely cited essays in the history of science, and it is the most widely reprinted scientific essay in the English language. Really a profound statement of this collective action problem. And we can, they can exist at collective back rubs, too. I got this off the internet. You can't really see what's going on here very well, but you have this chain of people giving back rubs. What prevents one person from just kind of reneging and being a lazy back rubber? In fact, I think this person, look at her hands there. They're not even up on the shoulders. Let's blow this up a little bit. Yep, she's cheating. Her hands are just resting on the chair in front of her. I have a hypothesis about what's causing this. She has a pint of ale right next to her, and everybody else has a half pint of Coke right next to them. So is there any way we can get lights down or brightness up on this a little bit? Okay. And then lastly, and most significantly, there's the issue, of out-group cooperation. You probably want them a little higher if you're videoing, huh? Yeah. 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 Out-group cooperation or radical altruism, what in the New Testament tradition would be called enemy love. That's really hard to explain evolutionarily. David Barash in Sociobiology and Behavior says, evolutionary biology is quite clear that what's in it for me is the ancient refrain of all life. Even stronger, Michael Gisel, and this is a classic quote, says, given a full chance to act in his own interest, nothing but expediency will restrain him from brutalizing, maiming, murdering his brother, his mate, his parent, or his child. Scratch an altruist, watch a hypocrite bleed. No hint of charity ameliorates our vision of society once sentimentalism has been laid aside. This is a profound change in worldview that has emerged over the last century and consummated within the last few years. A little cartoon embodying this. And I want to say a word about the cultural and theological context of this change. I mean, first of all, it has its roots not just in Darwin, but in the Victorian transition and the concomitant disillusionment with Romanticism. And two things about that. First of all, of course, there is the demise of natural theology. And secondly, this disillusionment with Romanticism kind of soured the view that somehow nature was intrinsically good or beneficent. Really well epitomized in Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem In Memoriam. This round of green, this orb of flame, i.e. earth and sun, fantastic beauty such as lurks in some wild poet when he works without a conscience or an aim. So that's the demise of natural theology or purpose. And then here's the demise of love. Who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with ravin shrieked against his creed. By the way, this was written 9 years before The Origin was published, so this was in the air already. And has culminated really in two different epistemologies. Around the same time, 3 years before this poem, Kierkegaard was struggling with the same questions. How can we have confidence in the reality of love. And he ended up with this epistemology: one must believe in love, otherwise one will never become aware that it exists. And in extended meditation and works of love, he actually has this wonderful reflection where he says, and I think it's true of relationships as well as cosmic questions, he says, for those who reject the reality of love, no proof is sufficient. And for those who start with that as their initial commitment, all things are proof. And then sometime later, Garrett Hardin and the Limits of Altruism posits the exact opposite approach. We must start with the assumption of pure self-interest, and if this is wrong, we'll find out. Of course, if Kierkegaard is right, we won't find out if we start with that assumption. Now, what implications does this tension have for science and religion? I mean, the tension is undeniable. I want to suggest, first of all, that this tension does not represent conflict between science and religion, but different starting assumptions, different epistemological starting points for engaging the natural world that are not equal to science versus religion. There's nothing about Hardin's starting commitment that is requisite to doing science. One could start with another, from another starting point. And rather it reflects, I believe, ambiguity in the world and then the human experience of the world. And this ambiguity involves tensions within both scientific and religious views in the world. There are scientific and religious traditions that are both, to use a well-worn phrase, involve the way of negation and the way of affirmation. So these are tensions within and not between science and religion. But it does so happen that for the last 100 years or so, the natural sciences have embodied the way of negation. And then lastly, I'm not altogether resistant to the skepticism of science in these issues, because it's probably a correction from an overly sentimentalistic view of the natural world by romanticism. What we need to do is find our way between sentimentalism and scientism in a way, by the way, that the philosopher Hans Jonas argues mirrors the need to find our way between idealism, denying the importance of material reality, and reductive materialism. So what we're looking for is a balance here. Can religion help us as we engage the science? What are the modes of response? Well, first of all, there's theological accommodation. John Hott, is John lecturing for you at some point in the Faraday series? He's an evolutionary theologian, and he says that actually Darwin is a friend of theology because it challenges us to give up cherished but ultimately unjustified theological commitments that we had prior to Darwin. Now, by the way, Hott would not say on this issue of love that we should give it up, but maybe some things we should give up. Michael Roos takes a step farther, and he says this issue in particular we should give up. In a fascinating essay called Evolutionary Theory and Christian Ethics, Are They in Harmony? Roos says, no, they're not in harmony. Evolutionary theory teaches us that agape or altruistic love is a biological impossibility, and therefore morally requiring it is morally perverse. We ought to just give it up. In this case, science determines the content of religion. You could go the other direction, the direction of what Alvin Plantinga has called theistic science, where you start with overt theological commitments, and then you formulate a science around those commitments. And Plantinga says, well, people do that all the time. We start with metaphysical commitments, or the commitment to the reality of causal agency or the unidirectional flow of time, and then we build a science around those things. Plantinga says we should do that. Not to be confused, by the way, with the intelligent design movement. It often is. Intelligent design works the other way around. It tries to make theological inferences or compelling arguments for theological commitments from science. Plantinga wants to do the opposite. He wants to be overt about theological pre-commitments and then build a science around them. I kind of want to say like Benvolio in Romeo and Juliet, a plague on both your houses, that there actually is some truth to both of these, but neither of them exclusively are error-free. And what I would like to suggest is genuine science and religion dialogue. Now, I know this term has become a cliche, but unfortunately it's a cliche that is largely untried. When we talk about dialogue, it's usually a monologue. Science telling religion what it should believe, or religion circumscribing what science can conclude. And here's my proposal for this particular topic, but it would be my proposal in general. I think you've just seen it this morning in Simon Conway Morris's talk. religion can serve as a reservoir of hypotheses about the world that might not be suggested or entailed by prevailing scientific theory, but are fully testable by scientific theory. Right now, the predominant evolutionary account of human nature suggests human altruism is impossible. It might be that religious pre-commitments would suggest, I don't believe that. But then you don't invent a new science to demonstrate it. You test it with the same scientific methodologies that you test any other ideas with. So here we go. Let's have a run at it in that spirit. Here's what I'm suggesting. Just a little tentative reach across the divide of religion towards science. Well, first of all, theoretical breakthroughs. The sociobiological revolution. There were two, actually. William Hamilton developed the theory of kin selection. It was really a complete reconceptualization of the notion of fitness. Prior to Hamilton, we thought of fitness in terms of how many offspring you have. Subsequent to Hamilton, we thought of fitness largely in terms of the gene, how many copies of a gene found their way into the next generation. And therefore, it could make sense for any individual to be genuinely sacrificial if the benefit to the recipient times the percentage of genetic relatedness exceeded the degree of reduction in fitness to the individual. In other words, in the sense of what's called inclusive fitness, the proportion of my genome making it into the next generation, it actually isn't a sacrifice. Are you with me? So right here in England, actually, J.B.S. Haldane was doodling on a napkin in a pub one night, and he says, aha, I'll gladly give my life for 2 brothers or 4 cousins. Now, actually, that's not quite right. It should have been 2 brothers or 8 cousins. It's a very interesting transmutation in the textbooks. 10 years ago, they all reported it 2 and 4. Now it's been changed to 2 and 8. But that's what it should be. Index of relatedness between you and your cousins is 0.125. So that's the notion of kin selection, and it turned out that it looked like it solved the problem of the sterile caste in social insects. They have a unique situation, a genetic situation called haplodiploidy, where sisters have an index of genetic... You are all related to your siblings and your children, if you have children, with an index of 0.5. Sisters in the social insects are related to sisters with an index of 0.75. So actually, their inclusive fitness is higher working for their sisters than they would be if they had their own children. However, their index of social genetic relatedness to brothers is only 0.25. So Robert Trivers made a prediction. If this is right, he argued that even though we can't tell the difference, that worker ants should be able to tell the difference between male and female larvae and provide more food for the females than the males. And so they actually marked larvae, then weighed the amount of food given to them, then sexed them when they emerged. Turns out the average ratio in 11 different species of ants in the tropics was 3-to-1, females to males, corresponding to the 0.75, 0.25 index of genetic relatedness. Are you with me? This is a fun story about a theoretical innovation apparently solving a problem, making a prediction, and it turns out that it has been amply reinforced by other experimental and observational studies. But hang on, it's not the end of the story. In a few minutes, we'll come back to that. But that doesn't solve everything. Clearly, there are situations of helping where there is no relatedness. And actually, it was Robert Trivers, again, who proposed the notion of reciprocal altruism. In this case, well, that sounds like a contradiction in terms. If it's reciprocal, how can it be altruism? And it's reciprocal altruism in the sense that I may help you based on the likelihood that at some future time you'll help me. And the degree of sacrifice should be less than the compensatory benefit back to the altruist times the likelihood of the benefit occurring. And that would suggest, by the way, even at the cultural level, that where there are cultural values to be helpful, people ought to be more helpful. And there are numerous studies in animals and human populations that bear this one out. In fact, these two theoretical breakthroughs look so promising that Richard Alexander said that anybody who believed the adequacy of the Darwinian paradigm prior to these ideas turns out to have been right only by coincidence. So anemic was our ability to explain these important issues prior to them. There is no good, adequate warrant to accept Darwinism, in Alexander's view. But prior to them, there's every good warrant to. It's called a revolution, in many people's view, equivalent to a second Darwinian revolution, and I want to make 3 comments about this nature of this revolution. First of all, it aspires to, or it claims, explanatory sufficiency. These 2 principles, kin selection and reciprocal altruism, are claimed to explain everything, all social behavior. In a sense, it's eros uber alles. No agape, no friendship. In all the vast evolutionary literature of the first 20 years after this, I find it just stunning. There's nothing on friendship, for example. Most of us experience friendships as opposed to just business relationships as entailing precisely the inattention to reciprocity. To the very extent we're keeping tabs on reciprocity, we probably think that person's not a friend yet. Anyways, explanatory sufficiency. Richard Alexander, in his powerful quote, "I suspect that nearly all humans believe it is a normal part of the functioning of every human individual now and then to assist someone else in the realization of that person's own interests, to the actual net expense of those of the altruist. What this greatest intellectual revolution of the century tells us is that, despite our intuitions, there is not a shred of evidence to support this view of beneficence, and a great deal of convincing theory suggests that any such view will eventually be judged false. There do not seem to be any remaining reasons for invoking anything other than nepotism and favoritism, that is to say, kin and reciprocity, to account for human societal structure." So there's the aspiration for total explanatory sufficiency. Secondly, there's a really profound exegetical reductionism here. And I would describe this in terms of not just eros uber alles, but a lame eros. And I'm borrowing this term from Martin Buber in his book, Between Man and Man. He has this wonderful passage where he reflects on what he calls full-orbed eros, soaring out to meet the other in all their otherness. Lame eros he describes as preening oneself in one's own emotive potency, warming oneself at the blaze of happenstance. In other words, whatever happens to come our way biologically, kind of parasitizing fulfillment off of that. And this exegetical reductionism puts the agenda of the gene first rather than the importance of engaging the other. Let me just give you a few quotes on this. Richard Dawkins says, "Everything exists for the gene. Genes themselves just are." What does that lead to? Well, David Barris says, "What appears to be altruism at the level of bodies can be plain old selfishness at the level of genes." Now, here's the comment I want to make, and this is why I call it reductionism. We could turn this statement around entirely. The issue here is, what's the primary claim about reality? We could say what appears to be selfishness at the level of genes is indeed genuine altruism at the level of organisms. In fact, that's what I would claim. And then lastly, George Bernard Shaw in Man and Superman has the devil in his Don Juan chapter claiming this: "Ages of faith, of romance, and of science are all driven at last to have but one prayer: make me a healthy animal." And again, one could turn this around entirely. We could say this: ages of the biotic quest for organismal flourishing or health have given rise, out of that quest has emerged faith, romance, and science. An emergent perspective that suggests the quest to be a healthy animal produces these things, rather than these things ultimately reduce to the nothing buttery of the quest for individual advantage. Am I going too fast? Okay. Pink. Okay. Lastly, I told you I would do this. It turns out that pretensions notwithstanding, the revolution was incomplete. Didn't get the job done. First of all, for 30 years, kin selection was a vibrant industry, professedly explaining the social insects and most other examples of altruism. There are always some naysayers, but most recently its most passionate advocate, E.O. Wilson, in a fascinating article in a sociological journal in their series on mistakes in the natural sciences, has completely, basically retracted his commitment to the viability of this explanation. His words is that it has collapsed, and it does not adequately explain even eusociality in insects. And he has changed boats to another theory called group selection, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But perhaps more importantly than even the inadequacy of kin selection and the social insects, there's just the anomaly of human altruistic cooperation. It appears not to conform to the predictions that we would make by kin selection or reciprocal altruism. Harman Holcomb, graduate philosopher of science who did his work under the Elliot Sober philosopher of science, did a major philosophical study of sociobiology 20 years in. And Holcomb concludes this. By the way, he's an advocate of sociobiology. He just thinks it is incomplete. He says the problem of an incomplete evolutionary theory is a contradiction between expectations produced by Darwinian selection theory and social data. That is, it would lead us to think that widespread altruism cannot evolve, but we observe that widespread altruism is a fact. So the sociobiological revolution didn't explain the quandary. Where can we go? So there's some really fascinating new proposals, all of them highly debated on the table, in 3 different areas. One of them are called individual benefit theories, basically traditional Darwinian selection. It's not kin selection, not reciprocity, but there's some other advantage to the individual. One of them actually was developed by University of Michigan evolutionary biologist Richard Alexander. I've quoted him several times already, called indirect reciprocity. So I'll invite Dennis over for dinner, and even if he doesn't invite me back, he may say a good word to Rodney, and then Rodney will invite me over for dinner. Indirect reciprocity, and by the way, this is believed only or primarily to exist in humans because the indirect return is mediated by reputation. So you have to have organisms that can transmit reputational information, which would seem to require memory and language and intense ability to recognize individuals. But the same cost-benefit logic works. A sacrifice makes sense if it's less than the benefit to me times the likelihood I will receive that benefit by indirect means, indirect or reputational enhancement. Alexander says that morality is basically the exchange medium for reputation. It's a pretty cynical view. He says that conscience is a reputation alarm that goes off when we're cheating in a way likely to be detected. Alexander's popularizer, Robert Wright, who wrote a popular book on evolutionary psychology called The Moral Animal, put it this way. He says, no parent really wants to teach their child to be good. They want to teach their child to be bad and get away with it. What Alexander would say is people are as good as it pays to be, and they're as bad as they can get away with. And that seems a tremendously cynical view, and there's probably also some truth to it. All of us are that way some of the time, and maybe some of us are that way all of the time, but Cornell economist Stephen Frank didn't think that was enough. In a really sublime book on the evolution of the emotions as mediators of exchange, he says, no, it's not that way. It's not that all of us are as good as it pays to be, and we rationally calculate the return or the penalty on everything we do. He takes a simple example like tipping in an out-of-town restaurant. Why would anybody ever tip in an out-of-town restaurant if they're never going to go back there and there's no possible way impact on their reputation? And Frank says what's going on is when it's actually virtue ethics gone to evolutionary biology school. He says that we develop by behaviors that don't get reciprocated, we nevertheless develop hard-to-fake emotive nonverbal signals, which signal others that we are good reciprocators. But here's the interesting thing. We can't do that for that reason. There's a really wonderful saying called, honesty may be the best policy, but he who is honest for that reason is not an honest man. So Frank says the paradox here is that it pays to be good, but it only pays to be good if you're being good for reasons other than its payment. Are you with me? However, there's a constraint. Frank says that we nevertheless, not by conscious choice, but by evolutionary constraint, we will only be as good as it pays us back by these emotive signals. So we tip in an out-of-town restaurant, and that's very common, but much, much, much less common is the Good Samaritan story, where somebody just writes a blank check and says, whatever it costs, take care of the person. There's some interesting empirical data to suggest that humans indeed are quite good at reading subtle facial cues. Now, these cues aren't so subtle. This is work done by Paul Ekman on expressions of human faces. He's done this in over 100 different cultures. Entirely universal ability to read at least fundamental emotional patterns in a human face. But more recently at the University of Michigan, and this is unpublished data, but it's a fascinating experiment. What they did was this. They took 200 students in an introductory psychology class, and they had a subset of them read Little Red Riding Hood into a video camera, just a benign exercise like that. And then they had these people take a questionnaire, both about their attitudes toward helping others, and also filled out a time questionnaire in terms of how much time they spent in soup kitchens or ministry to the handicapped or something like that. And they gave them an altruism score. And then they played these videotapes of people reading Little Red Riding Hood to this group of students, and they had them rank them in terms of their altruistic tendencies just by their facial expressions reading Little Red Riding Hood. There's a highly statistically significant correlation between the students' rankings and the actual performance on the questionnaire and where they actually spent their time. And I'm not going to discuss this, but then in computer analysis of the facial expressions, they actually honed in the statistically significant aspects of facial gesturing. And it was the autonomic, the non-volitional ones, by the way, that it looks like they're the cues. Really interesting work. Now, lastly, in the individual benefit. So if there are these hard-to-fake cues and maybe impossible to fake cues that are effective in insinuating each of us into a cooperative social matrix, what would be the actual best way of getting without cooperating if that's where the thrust of our genes? Conscious deception won't work because you can't fake the autonomic cues. But self-deception would. That is the best way to pass a lie detector test, is to be convinced that you are who you say you are, even if you're not who you say you are. So here arises self-deception theory. There's an interesting article a few years ago that actually argues that the Christian love command is the most ingenious way of exploiting others, because you have all these people walking around who think that their goal in life is to lay down their lives for other people. They sincerely but inauthentically believe that. In other words, to quote a Christian cliche, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. But they think they walk the walk. Now, there's actually some social, psychological, and neurological work that suggests, and this is a slippery issue, what even self-deception would mean, what kind of a self could deceive a self. But first of all, there's social psychology, well-demonstrated phenomenon called self-bias, where people consistently overestimate their own virtue, their own contribution to collaborative projects. A few years ago, they gave, on the SAT test in the U.S., largest college entrance exam, to 17,000 students. They asked them to rank themselves in terms of their sensitivity to others and ability to get along with them. And 75% of them ranked themselves in the upper 20%. And 25% of them ranked themselves in the upper 5%. So everybody thinks they're a really good person and better than most other people. And in terms of a substrate for this, a really interesting experiment. You can do, you can play a person's voice for them on a tape recorder. And it turns out that when you hear your own voice, well, first of all, most people can identify it consciously. That's me. But there's also an autonomic response. In the presence of your own voice, there's an electromyographic signal that is given off. And if you just play it, they agree with one another. You recognize your voice, and autonomically you recognize it. Now you take that person and you give them a test, a pre-test. And it's a moderately easy exam, and they get a fair number right, but a few wrong. And you tell them, oh man, you really blew it. You are one of the lowest out of thousands of people who have taken this exam. And autonomically, they still recognize their own voice, but there's a negative cognitive distortion. They say, when you play them their own voice, they say, that's not me. They're not lying, by the way. They honestly don't recognize their own voice. There's some sort of identity retraction, a retraction of ego boundaries. And the opposite is true if you say, whoa, you aced that exam. You're the best out of thousands. Then there's this ego swelling, and everybody's me. You play them voices that are similar to their own, and they own it as their own. Now, what on earth does this have to do with self-deception? All it has to do is that at some level of brain function, there is awareness of reality that at the cognitive level becomes distorted positively or negatively. And that's what self-deception theory would say about altruistic intent. At some level, there is the commitment to advantage, but there's a self-biased distortion toward thinking of our motives as better than they ought to be. So what can we say about these ideas? Well, in one sense, first of all, I would say they're all true. And not only true, but they're all affirmed by most religious traditions. Most religions and virtually all secular wisdom traditions says there's great value in reputation. Proverbs says, for example, a good reputation is more valuable than rubies. And self-deception theory, well, there's at least in the Abrahamic tradition, there's a long tradition of recognizing the human tendency to deceive oneself. The prophet Jeremiah says, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked, who can know it? And the entire prophetic tradition in the Abrahamic traits are a persistent challenge, not so much to return to theological orthodoxy, but to close the gap between professed theological commitment and perhaps sincere but inauthentic professed commitment and what the real commitment is. So they're all true, but this is no news to the religious traditions. They're all helpful, in fact. They can remind us of constraints on what it means to be embodied, but they're all incomplete. None of these appear to get the job done in terms of explaining radical human altruism. They explain constraints on altruism. And that has been widely recognized by two more recent emerging traditions. First of all, group selection, which has been considered a heresy in evolutionary theory since the 1950s, but there's been a return to group selection, which basically says this, that genes are replicators. They're units of information that reproduce themselves and that get selectively transmitted. That's how evolution works. But natural selection doesn't see genes. Natural selection sees the expression of genes. Our bodies, which might be called vehicles in sense of they're what take the genes into the next generation. Traditional evolutionary theory says the vehicle is the individual. Group selection says, well, no, groups of individuals interacting with one another can have differential functionality or flourishing and take the genes into the next generation. All that needs to happen is, and you can get a genuine altruist within the group, if the intra-group variance in fitness is less than the intergroup variance in fitness. All that means is, think of a sports team. You can get somebody on a sports team that gets paid less than somebody else who scores more points. And maybe that person is always feeding on the ball to score those points. That will be a viable strategy as long as the team wins against another team where everybody is selfish. So that's the breakthrough insight of group selection theory. The intragroup decrement of fitness can be real. I really can do something for Rodney where he comes out ahead and I come out behind if our coalition on the whole does better than another coalition with less cooperation. Are you with me? Fascinating idea. There's interesting experimental results, some specific kind of interesting example. For example, hens. Let's say you want as many eggs as you possibly can. Typical breeding procedures stress individual selection. If you want a big dog, you just breed the biggest dog in every litter. If you want a hen that lays a lot of eggs, you take the hen in a hen house that lays the greatest amount of eggs. It turns out that doesn't work as well as if you take groups of hens that lay the most total eggs. And the reason is you actually get more eggs if you breed for it at the group rather than the individual level. Well, what about assessing these ideas? Well, good news and bad news. The good news is that group selection theory, for the first time, actually gives us an theoretical substrate for accounting for how it is that anybody could ever be genuinely self-relinquishing to somebody else. Here's the bad news. It's driven by intergroup competition and hostility. So its major promoter, David Sloan Wilson, says the dark side of in-group altruism is out-group hostility. What group selection can't explain is the thing we most want to explain, the most radical form of altruism, the love your enemy kind of altruism. Kristen Warwick Monroe is a social scientist who did the most extensive study on Holocaust survivors done to date. Something very dear to my own heart because that's my father's background. He is a Holocaust survivor, and these issues are part of what has made me very interested in this area. She's not a creationist or an anti-evolutionist by any means, but on the basis of her study, she concluded that regarding biological explanations, that they have nothing to contribute to our understanding of the more extreme forms of altruistic behavior. The individualistic paradigm and implicit assumption of self-interest on which Darwinian biology is based appears unable to account for situations of genuine sacrifice of people not of one's kin or social group. She goes on to suggest that we need an altogether different paradigm. And we have one, and here it is. And it's very controversial, but people have taken this seriously and basically said, well, biology can't explain these things, but we do want an evolutionary paradigm. That might seem a contradiction in terms, but here's why it isn't. Group selection has the same replicator, genes, scaling in different vehicles, organisms or groups or maybe even entire societies. Hierarchical selection, also called memetics or cultural coevolution, actually has different replicators. Genes are units of replicating information that influence who you are and what all life is. But maybe there's another kind of replicator that is not genetic in nature. And by the way, the interesting thing is this applies to humans and only humans. They're ideational, genetically irreducible information. They're ideas, basically. They emerge from genes, but they're not reducible to genes, and they exert genuine top-down causation, referring to some of the ideas that you heard on your first day, on your first day here. And in fact, because they're not reducible to genes, and because the causal influence is genuinely top-down, they don't have to go along with genes. So Bill Durham at Stanford says there are many different ways memes can interact with genes. They can be reinforcing, but they can be oppositional. Henry Plotkin here in the UK says there's no biological leash. At the very beginning of the talk, I talked about not determinism, but constraints. And Plotkin's saying constraints are off. I mean, in some sense, that we are unconstrained. He says there has been a decoupling from the causal mechanisms of our biological evolution. That's a fascinating statement. I mean, nobody has suggested that within biology in the 150 years since Darwin. It's a radical statement, and it's made, by the way, only so far for human beings. Joseph Lopreto puts it this way in Human Nature and Biocultural Evolution. This is a fascinating statement. I'm drawing to a close, by the way. conceptions of a cultural nature, he speaks of these memes, that thwart the self-serving thrust of the gene. The soul, principal among them, can be thought of as the kernel of an internalized morality, reinforced by fictitious forces whereby some humans are led to subordinate their genetic fitness and their self-interest in general to the fitness and interests of others. Even strangers who are in no position to reciprocate, to some extent, the concept of a soul. What he's really saying is the notion of a transcendent eternal purpose to life has modified the genetic action of natural selection. The fascinating thing is many theologians would say the same thing, that ideas, that as the Word becomes flesh, we become transformed. The only thing they wouldn't agree with is that these are fictitious forces. They would just believe that these are real entities that we believe in. By the way, the soul is not saying anything about dualism. It's saying something about an emergent or irreducible purpose to life. So how would we assess this last theory of mimetics? Well, I want to suggest that there are tensions, there are pros and cons to this. On the one hand, there's this wonderful, I think, and theologically very hospitable notion that the Word becomes and transforms the flesh. On the other hand, it does so in mimetic theory at the cost of organismic agency. In an effort to stay Darwinian, all your mind is a vehicle for memes. So just as bodies are only genes' way of reproducing themselves, Susan Blackmore, author of the book Meme Theory, says that a mind is just a meme's way of reproducing itself. We become infected by these memes, much like your body gets infected by a virus. It's not an issue of agency. So that's a downside. On the one hand, this is really startling to me as a biologist. There is a reaffirmation in the most radical terms of human uniqueness. Only humans do these things. I mean, it's not only extrasomatic storage of information, that's what a meme is, but it's the influence of that information to get us to do things that apparently, according to this theory, that genetic constraints alone won't allow us to do. On the other hand, there's a really explicit dualism involved here. Not only genes versus memes, but the role of humans in nature itself. Listen to this radical statement by Richard Dawkins. On the one hand, it's altruism affirming. On that, well, here we go. We have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth, cultivating and nurturing a pure, disinterested altruism, something that has no place in nature, something that has never existed before in the whole history of the world. Well, on the one hand, I want to say this statement, something that has never existed before in the whole history of the world. That's an interesting evolutionary statement, that there is, I believe, a direction or a telos to evolution that includes increased capacities to sense internal realities of the others, to cooperate with others, and ultimately to self-relinquishingly work for the benefit of others. This would sound absolutely theologically presumptuous to a scientist 10 years ago. But now I think it's fair to say we can actually say culminating in human altruism. It really hasn't existed before in the history of the world. But to say that it has no place in nature is to rip human beings out of nature, and to say that somehow nature itself is not a hospitable substrate to this altruism. That's a metaphysical statement, by the way, not a scientific statement. It's one that I disagree with strongly. I would say it does have a place in nature. The fact that we're here and in nature is suggestive of that. Thirdly, third of four, it accommodates altruism. It's the only theory that has an accommodating explanatory matrix for the existence of genuine, radical relinquishment for others' welfare. Yet it accommodates it at the cost of biotic flourishing. In mimetic theory, altruism is seen as one of two things. It's either seen as a pathological virus that infects us to get us to do things that our bodies aren't supposed to do. That's Michael Rusa's view, by the way. He calls it biological perversity. And he thinks Mother Teresa or anybody who would be celibate that's a pathology. On the other hand, in Dawkins' view, it's not a pathology. It's a genuinely appropriate moral aspiration, but it's a moral aspiration that we pursue in defiance of our biology. So in both cases, altruism has no hospitable place in who we are as embodied organisms. And in that sense, I would say, well, first of all, it's, again, there's no scientific demonstration of this, it's metaphysics, but I would say that it makes what I believe as, and my particular religious tradition is Christian, but it commits the ancient error of Gnosticism that says goodness lies only in a pure ideational state, and the enemy of goodness is our embodiment. And that's the theological error of memetics. And then lastly, well, the good news is it's genuinely non-reductive. It is a theory in evolutionary biology that says we don't reduce. The question of development, whether development reduces to genes, that's a separate question. But in terms of natural selection alone, there is a hierarchy of selectional processes, not just at the genetic level. That's the good news. The bad news is, and this is perhaps even being a bit charitable, it's explanatorily underspecified. What is a meme, anyways? How can we define it operationally? How could we measure the replication and transmission rates of memes? Perhaps most importantly, what on earth is the causal lever by which a meme would get us to do something that our genes were opposed to doing? So the geneticist at UC Berkeley, Gunther Stent, calls this a biological absurdity. And the mimetic theory is highly debated by biologists. By the way, it's explanatorily underspecified. I would say, let me make a proposal to you. There's a non-material entity that can infect your mind and make you do things contrary to your self-interest that your genes don't want you to do. Have I defined a meme, or have I described a demon? And in many respects, and I'm not meaning to be ad hominem here, at the current state of development, memetics is not altogether like. There's a vibrant science of demonology in the 16th century. It turned out not to have flourished, and maybe memetics won't flourish. Maybe it will assemble more experimental and theoretical precision, and maybe it will end up flourishing, but we don't know yet. Now let me tell you where I am. I'm at 6 minutes after, which is exactly 1 hour after I began. So I'm going to draw to a close, and what we'll do after the break is come back. I will use the theological retrospective comments at the very end to launch us into the next talk, which is on evolutionary theories of religion.
Evolutionary theory of religion, the origins of religion, we'll leave then up to the next session, but otherwise everything is open for discussion and questions. Who wants to start off the first question? With the mic.
I was interested in your last comment about explanatory, I've gotten insufficient explanational definition of a meme, because with a gene, it's already actually quite difficult to define what a gene is.
Yeah.
Even though we can say a gene produces a protein and so on. But if you want to say, is it one gene or 10 genes, you can more or less do that, even though there are complications. But supposing one were to ask, okay, we've identified a meme, but it's not actually one meme, it's 132 memes. I can't see any way in which you can define a meme rather than a set of memes. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, other than I agree with you. Now, I will say that just like there are assemblages of genes that work to a common task, there may be many genes that make proteins that all work on a common task controlled by a common regulatory mechanism. There is the suggestion of the existence of meme plexes, that is to say, groups of memes which work together. And that might be similar to a genome. There might be a memome. Here's the problem, and you're right, there are some problems in distinguishing genes, but we know what genes do. They make proteins. We know how genes are replicated. We can measure the transmission of genetic information. We can't do any of that with memes. In fact, there's not even disagreement about what a meme is. Some people think that a meme is an idea. Other people think that a meme is anything that can be imitated. In fact, the term itself, mimetics, comes from the same root as imitation and the Girardian notion of mimesis, although it's drifted very far from that. So some people think this is a meme, dun 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 dun, and or just the permutation of gestures in a population. Teach undergraduate students in Southern California, and it drives me crazy. If these are memes, the memes that spread through those populations, it's like every other word is like. I mean, I went to the store and then I bought a cup of coffee and so maybe that vocal mannerism is a meme, but there's no idea there. So there's a long rambling response to say that right now there's a tremendous amount of vagueness in just what constitutes a meme. Is it anything that can be imitated, or is it only an idea? By the way, if it is an idea, does it have to be understood to have mimetic potency? I mean, the notion pie is presumably a meme, but you can get anybody to say the word pie. So these are all unanswered questions. And then if we knew what a meme was, how it was transmitted, we still don't understand its causal lever.
Yes, Warren at the back. We can get the mic to the back.
Jeff, what if we substituted culture and family environment for memes, and then presumed children particularly to be self-organizing complex systems? Would that solve the problem of how memes affect persons to develop altruism?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a very promising line of questioning, but it wouldn't substitute or solve the question in two ways, actually. First of all, even before mimetics, evolutionary theory, and for that matter just genetics, recognize that the phenotypic expression of genes always occurs in an environmental context. So that's not new information. The environment influences the expression of phenotypes, and patterns in the environment will influence the expression of phenotypes in predictable ways. So it might be that familial environment and cultural environment, I mean, those are just environments. The question is whether the environment itself contains information, and family environments do, but here's the next step, information that is itself replicatable and differentially transmissible. And that's what mimetics is trying to do. Mimetics, rather than just saying environment and even patterned predictable aspects of the environment influence the phenotype, mimetics wants to say there's a separate stream of replicatable information to which we can apply Darwinian principles. So memes are variable. There are mutations in memes, and they're differentially replicatable. That's selection.
That's not culture.
Well, it may be culture. In fact, notions of cultural evolution, if they're Darwinian notions, invoke mimetic ideas. But it becomes the term cultural evolution has unfortunately been used in a range of unfortunately contrasting ways. In one very loose way, cultural evolution just means it changes over time, like we can talk of geological evolution. But that's not a Darwinian process, it just changes. The more rigorous Darwinian notion of cultural evolution is there is variability and differential reproduction of information. And if that's what you want to say, fine, but then we got to come up with a word for that information. And in his book, Coevolution, Bill Durham spends an entire chapter. He has about a dozen different candidates for what we want to call these units of cultural information. He says memes. If you don't want a unit of cultural information, well, then you don't have a Darwinian process. Then you have some other process.
Okay, well, let's go ahead. So we can have the mic.
I found the group selection theory more compelling, perhaps, than the memes. And you mentioned intergroup hostility as an argument maybe against it. Yeah, I didn't really see that in the terms of the hens. So is there another way that that group selection is limited as an option for altruism?
Well, I don't think intergroup hostility is an argument against it. It's just that intergroup competition is what drives group selection. And in the example that I gave you with hens, there actually is intergroup competition, and the owner of the different hen houses is the person that is instigating that group competition. You know, I'm choosing to kill off the groups of hens that don't lay a lot of eggs, and breed the groups of hens that do lay a lot of eggs. And the bottom line is this: for group selection to work, it's teamwork, right? Well, and somebody on the team is doing worse than somebody else on the team. If there's only one team, and there's no competition with other teams, then the person who's doing worse on the team is going to lose their job after a while. If you think of this in terms of actual offspring that they're leaving. If there are multiple teams and somebody's leaving less offspring, but the team as a whole is leaving more offspring than another team, then that process can sustain. And there may be even fissures and formation of new groups. So the bottom line is that for group selection to work, it has to be driven by, it's a competitive process. That's what selection is. Remember, selection, the definition of selection is differential reproduction of genotypes. That's what natural selection is. It can be at the group or individual election, but differential means somebody's doing better than somebody else.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
Well, does it really help, or did I lose you?
No, it really helps.
Yeah. The bottom line is if you have one group, you can't have group selection by definition.
Since I've got the mic in my hand, can I also just make a comment just back on the memes? I suppose in a way they're below the Darwinian horizon in the sense that Darwinian evolution works well when you have vertical transmission and you have inheritance of DNA, and that works pretty well. But when you get down to, say, bacteria, then they swap their good tricks, don't they? So you have horizontal transmission of genetic information between bacteria, and therefore some people call that going below the Darwinian horizon in a sense that once you get horizontal transmission of genetic information, it's very difficult to then construct Darwinian arguments because it sort of spoils the whole fun, really. I mean, once you've got horizontal transmission, you're on a different kind of process going on. And it seems to me if means existed, I don't believe they do, but then it would have to be that kind of, because there's horizontal transmission going on. So in a sense, you're below the Darwinian horizon in memetics. Is that how you would see it? Or?
Well, I think that's very aptly described. Now, here's what some people would say in response to that. And by the way, there's an interesting agenda here. The reason that the whole memetic industry has developed is because, in some sense, a number of individuals want to save the Darwinian paradigm. And if you think of the Darwinian paradigm as the variability and selective transmission of information, if it's a two-step process, if it's replication and selective transmission, then somebody like Richard Dawkins would say it's not below the Darwinian horizon. You can replicate vertically or phylogenetically, but you can also replicate horizontally. And the answer that some would give to your question is it's not a question of Darwinian versus Lamarckian dynamics. It's really a question of Mendelian versus Lamarckian dynamics, and you can have Darwinian selection either direction, as long as information is being replicated horizontally from me to you, or vertically from me to my offspring. You can have differential reproduction of information. So that'd be one response, but I happen to be a skeptic of memes myself, so I'm not going to work too hard to defend it.
Okay, we had a question down here, I think.
I'm slightly puzzled. It seems that on the one hand, altruism clearly is valued in the Jewish and Christian traditions, and I suppose Islamic, but I'm certainly no expert there. On the other hand, it's also very clear that altruism pays off, at least eschatologically, and that good works are rewarded and evil works are punished in these traditions. And maybe that it's eschatological, or the degree to which the payoff is eschatological is going to make all the difference here. I don't know. But what should Christians expect, or others like this, expect or hope for regarding evolutionary explanations? Should we be glad to see them work? Should we want them to fail, or sit serenely on the sidelines, or what?
Did everyone hear the question to that? Or maybe could you just repeat the question?
Well, it's a great question, and actually, as I heard it, there are two parts. First of all, acknowledging a tension in religious traditions themselves. On the one hand, altruism is a good thing and promoted. On the other hand, it's viewed as paying off, and
Right, but is that in this life or as or merely
does it
eschatological?
pay off in this life, or is that an eschatological promise? And then, secondly, so what should we think about naturalistic and, in particular, evolutionary theories about altruism? Actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the take-home comments.
Can you just define
Oh.
eschatological, please, for us?
So in end times, either in terms of the end of our own personal histories and possible resurrections for those traditions who believe in them, and then if there is a consummation or end of cosmic history itself. And, well, boy, that's a fantastic and also a very complicated question. I guess I would say two things about that. First of all, I think at least in the Abrahamic faiths, and also even in secular wisdom traditions, especially natural law traditions, the view of morality and the view of goodness is that it is not altogether an arbitrary imposition upon a inhospitable and recalcitrant created substrate, but rather it's the fulfillment of what we were created to be. So there ought to be a payoff for doing right. There's the statement of Jesus, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. A wonderful statement that suggests, and perhaps all the moral law is an exegesis of our natures and how to live in accord with and in ways that fulfill our natures. So that's the good news. But then in not only the Abrahamic, but as far as I know, really every religious tradition, and this is not true in the natural sciences because there's no metaphysical template for asking this question. But in the religious traditions, there is this sense of the tragedy of not being who we are made to be, and maybe even having innate inclinations that drive us away from who we are innately destined to be. And so in that sense, while altruism might entail natural flourishing, we may not have what it naturally takes to get there. So I would argue both. I would argue that just on the basis of biology, and I'll share some data with you in a little bit, there really is payoff in this life. And I think we should celebrate that. Whatever Christian tradition, it's an affirmation of a central telos of human existence that we should celebrate. And on the other hand, the Yale philosopher John Hare speaks of the moral gap. And he says the problem with all evolutionary ethics is that it creates either the problem of lowering moral expectations to fit who we are by nature, or inflating our conceptions of who we are by nature in such a way that we think can reach any moral demand. And Hare argues that the importance of all religious faiths, and he speaks from the Christian tradition, is that there is a moral gap. We need some help. And in that sense, I'm skeptical whether evolutionary theory or any fully scientific theory is ever going to be exhaustively explain how it is that humans reach the goal of self-relinquishing abandonment in the welfare of others.
Yes, that's good.
It is regarding the limitation of scientific method to explore or understand phenomena like altruism. What I was wondering that science we study is the science of average, in the sense that science of average, or the mean thing. I mean, in physics there is no theory of everything which explains all the phenomena and events in the physical world. Now we have a grip on the handle of understanding of the biological world in terms of when we have natural selection. But is it fair or right to apply natural selection or Darwinian evolution to explain behavior like altruism or selfishness or suppose the existence of Buddha or Mother Teresa on one hand and Hitler or Genghis Khan on the other, because I mean it's not just the average thing, it's the total dimension. And how can we expect that we will successfully apply one phenomena or natural law to explain all these, panoramic view of human minds?
That's a wonderful question. For those who couldn't hear it, the question was, well, especially in the populational or biological sciences, scientific theories explain averages. And is it fair to try to explain the entire range of human behavior by this idea of natural selection? And I think that's a great question. I would say several things to that. First of all, there's a range of approaches that evolutionary biologists try to take in explaining, and I don't just mean these different theories. I mean, specifically with reference to your question, there's actually a continuum. Some evolutionary biologists actually want to explain the entire range and give a fine-scaled explanation of the variance itself. Why are some people altruistic and some people non-altruistic? That's a pretty ambitious project, and not many are trying to do that. Next, however, and I'll weigh in on this. I think this is a legitimate line of inquiry. We may or may not come up with answers. Lots of evolutionary biologists want to explain the central tendencies in human behavior. And by the way, there are central tendencies, and there are observations of human universals, but by describing them as universal, it doesn't mean that every human on the planet in every culture at every point in history has done it. It just means that in every culture, most people have done it. Well, that seems to me to be fair game for at least to attempt a biological explanation, and we may miss. And then most modestly, some people say, well, shoot, I just want to see if there are limits, if there are biological limits to human behavior. And clearly there are some biological limits. So in Simon's talk, we saw pictures of organisms that fly and on their own power, and we don't. That's a genuine biological limit to human behavior. I started the talk by saying that on the basis of apparently sound evolutionary reasoning, it looks like that there are biological limits to the human capacity to behave altruistically. And here's the wonderful thing about science. The world pushes back, and although we spent several decades trying to deconstruct human behavior to fit these ideas, we've pretty much given up. And it really looks like that humans don't fit those limits. So we're going to have to come up with some other idea. Maybe it's a mimetics. Maybe it's some version of systems theory, developmental systems theory. Maybe at some point, and I know some people are saying, well, no, there is no naturalistic explanation. It's a miracle. Jesus says, for example, they'll know you're my disciples by this, that you have love for one another. By the way, I would say this, whether or not it's a miracle, I would say the strongest testimony of the reality of a religious dimension to life is not proving one side on disputes over the age of the earth or the issue of common descent, but it's coming up with a pattern of behavior that really betokens transcendent reality.
Oh. Good. I think that's probably okay. You have one question. Is it a quick question?
Yeah, short question.
Yeah,
Actually,
sure.
somehow related to this. You mentioned that there are some.
Can you just wait for the microphone? Sorry, otherwise you won't pick up. Thank you.
You mentioned that some individuals are altruistic, others are not altruistic. I would say even it's more complicated. I would say the same person, for example, mother, could be a stepmother. She could be a very good mother for his children and could be a very bad mother for the other children. So probably the situation is much more complicated somehow.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned before in terms of reciprocal just something as common as reciprocity. Reciprocity exists in all cultures, but the standards and levels of reciprocity vary. So I was dramatically surprised when I ran out of oil one time in the rural community in the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming, and in the middle of nowhere, 3 cars passed us. Every one of the 3 cars pulled over, said, "Do you need help? I'm out of oil." oh, here I have an extra can. Every one of them gave us a can of oil. And, you know, you can keel over of a heart attack in New York City, and people will walk right by and not even call. So even on the level of reciprocity, culture-wide, central tendencies vary. And that's certainly true between religious traditions, between individuals. It's true in my own life. Temporarily, I vary in my capacity to live up to these ideals. I would say one quick thing, we need to go to break in response to your question. There's actually a specific example. There's actually a fairly robust and empirically verified evolutionary theory in terms of parenting and parental abuse of who gets abused. And it is dramatically more, stepchildren are dramatically more frequently abused than biological children. Interestingly enough, that's not true of adopted children, so that's a little anomaly there.
Good, that's a very stimulating thought on which to close this session. Thank you, Jeff, very much again.